September nights in Virginia carry whispers of the past. In 1987, 2 young lives vanished into darkness near the James River, their deaths echoing the Colonial Parkway murders that terrorized couples across Tidewater. For 37 years, water kept its secrets, until science refused to let silence win. What emerges when time finally surrenders its truth? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The warm September air drifted across Isle of Wight County like a gentle promise. Friday evening, September 18th, 1987, David Lee Knobling adjusted his rearview mirror and smiled at his younger cousin sitting in the passenger seat of his black Ford Ranger. At 20, David had the easy confidence of someone who'd found his place in the world, selling farm equipment, helping family, building a future one handshake at a time. "You sure Robin's going to be there?" his cousin asked, fidgeting with excitement. "She said she'd meet us at the movie theater," David replied, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from small-town trust. The plan was simple: drop his cousin at the cinema, spend some time with 14-year-old Robin Edwards, maybe grab a late dinner. Nothing complicated, nothing dangerous. The streets of Isle of Wight County felt safe in 1987. Neighbors left doors unlocked. Teenagers walked home after dark, without fear. Parents worried about grades and curfews, not predators lurking in shadows. This was Virginia farm country, where the James River curved through wooded refuge areas, and families had lived for generations. Robin Margaret Edwards was waiting exactly where she'd promised. 14 years old, spirited, balancing the curiosity of adolescence with the trust of someone who'd never encountered real evil. She waved when she saw David's truck, her smile bright against the dimming sky. "Thanks for the ride," David's cousin said, hopping out at 20. "The theater entrance. See you later." David waved goodbye, then turned to Robin. "Want to drive around for a while? Maybe head out to Ragged Island?" The Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge stretched along the James River, like a natural sanctuary. During the day, it attracted birdwatchers and fishermen. At night, it became a quiet retreat, where young couples could talk beneath the stars. Robin nodded, sliding closer to David in the truck's bench seat. They drove through the gathering darkness, headlights cutting through the warm September air. The radio played softly. Neither knew they were being watched. Neither sensed the presence that would transform this ordinary Friday night into a decades-long mystery. As midnight approached, David left his family home. The truck's engine hummed reassuringly as he navigated the familiar roads leading toward the refuge. 30 minutes later, Robin departed her own house, telling her parents she was spending time with friends. The convergence was innocent, 2 young people seeking connection in a world that felt entirely safe. The Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge stretched across 1,531 acres of wetlands and forest. Accessed by a single winding road, it offered privacy and natural beauty. During hunting season, the area buzzed with activity. In September, it remained peacefully empty. David guided his truck along the gravel access road, windows down to catch the river breeze. The James River flowed nearby, its current steady and ancient. Moonlight reflected off the water like scattered silver. Everything felt normal. Everything felt right. What happened next would remain hidden for 37 years. The details emerged slowly, piece by piece, as investigators would later reconstruct the timeline. Both David and Robin reached the refuge sometime after midnight. Whether they arrived together or separately became a crucial question that would haunt detectives for decades. Someone else was there, someone who understood the area's isolation, someone who knew how the river's current could carry away evidence, someone who had studied the patterns of young couples seeking privacy in remote locations. The attack was swift and calculated. No witnesses heard screams. No passing motorists noticed disturbances. The refuge's 1,531 acres swallowed sound like a vast, natural tomb. By morning, David Lee Knobling and Robin Margaret Edwards had vanished from the earth. Their families would spend the weekend wondering, calling friends, checking hospitals, growing increasingly desperate as hours stretched into eternity. The silence that followed would last nearly 4 decades. Monday morning, September 21st, arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes Virginia autumns legendary. A state patrol officer conducting routine checks at the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge noticed something unusual near the boat launch. A black Ford Ranger, sitting with its engine running. The officer approached cautiously. The truck's driver door stood wide open. Windshield wipers swept across dry glass in rhythmic, pointless motion. The radio played softly, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. Inside, the officer found David's wallet, undisturbed. No signs of theft, no indications of struggle. Just an abandoned vehicle humming with electronic life. Its occupants vanished without explanation. The discovery triggered immediate concern. David Knobling was known throughout the county as responsible and reliable. He didn't abandon trucks. He didn't disappear without telling family. The open doors and running engine suggested something had interrupted him suddenly, something that demanded immediate attention. Within hours, search teams combed the refuge. Volunteers walked grid patterns through tall grass and wetlands. Helicopters circled overhead. Bloodhounds followed scent trails that led to the river's edge and stopped. The James River held its secrets tightly. Its current ran strong toward the Chesapeake Bay, carrying debris and evidence downstream. Search boats dragged the water near the refuge, finding nothing but silt and tangled vegetation. As night fell, David's truck was towed to the state police garage for processing. Fingerprint technicians dusted every surface. Evidence collectors photographed the interior from dozens of angles. The running engine and active wipers became crucial details that would echo through decades of investigation. Word spread through Isle of Wight County like ripples on water. David Knobling was missing. His truck had been found under mysterious circumstances. Something was terribly wrong in their safe, small community. Parents began calling their teenagers home early. Doors that had remained unlocked for generations suddenly required deadbolts. The refuge that had provided peaceful sanctuary now felt ominous and threatening. But the worst was yet to come. September 23rd dawned gray and misty. The James River moved sluggishly beneath low-hanging clouds, its surface broken only by the occasional heron or fishing boat. Early morning joggers along the shoreline noticed debris washing up, with the tide branches, plastic containers, the usual river detritus. Then someone saw what didn't belong. Two bodies, floating approximately 100 feet apart, had washed ashore near a bend in the river. The current had carried them downstream from the refuge, depositing them on a sandy beach like offerings to the morning mist. The discovery shattered the last fragments of hope that David and Robin might be found alive. Emergency responders cordoned off the area, while crime scene technicians photographed everything from multiple angles. The bodies had been in the water for days, partially decomposed, their clothing disturbed by current and time. Medical examiners arrived to supervise the recovery. Even in death, David and Robin deserved dignity and careful attention. Each piece of evidence was catalogued, each observation recorded. The river had damaged much, but it hadn't erased everything. Initial examination revealed gunshot wounds. David had been shot in the head and shoulder. Robin showed evidence of execution-style trauma to the back of the skull. The clinical language couldn't diminish the horror. Two young people had been murdered with calculated precision. Robin's clothing was partially removed and disheveled. The medical examiner noted findings consistent with violent assault. The killer hadn't simply murdered, he had violated and terrorized before taking their lives. News of the discovery spread through Isle of Wight County like wildfire. Parents who had maintained hope for their children's safe return now faced the unthinkable reality. Two families prepared for funerals instead of homecomings. The investigation transformed from missing persons to double homicide. Detectives established a command post at the state police barracks. Evidence technicians prepared for exhaustive analysis. The FBI offered assistance, particularly given similarities to recent couples' murders along the Colonial Parkway. The peaceful community that had awakened Friday morning to ordinary concerns now confronted extraordinary evil. Someone had stalked and killed two innocent young people. Someone was still out there. Inside the state medical examiner's office in Richmond, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across steel examination tables. The bodies of David Lee Knobling and Robin Margaret Edwards lay beneath white sheets, awaiting the careful scrutiny that would help solve their murders. The chief medical examiner approached each case with scientific precision tempered by human empathy. These weren't merely specimens, they were someone's children, stolen from families who would never recover from the loss. David's autopsy revealed 2 gunshot wounds. The first bullet had entered behind his right ear, traveling through brain tissue before lodging in the skull's opposite side. The second wound, to his shoulder, suggested he had been shot while trying to flee or protect Robin. Robin's examination proved more devastating. The execution-style gunshot wound to her head indicated she had been forced to kneel before being killed. Evidence of violent assault was unmistakable. Her final moments had been filled with terror and pain. The murder weapon appeared to be a .38 caliber revolver, based on bullet fragments recovered during autopsy. The killer had used hollow-point ammunition, designed to inflict maximum damage. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was calculated execution. Most crucially, trace evidence was recovered from Robin's body. Semen samples were preserved using the limited DNA protocols available in 1987. The science was primitive, but forensic technicians followed emerging guidelines for evidence preservation. River water had degraded much of the biological material. Salt content and bacterial action had corrupted cellular structure. However, microscopic fragments survived, locked in tissue samples that were carefully frozen and stored according to new state protocols. The ballistic evidence proved equally challenging. Water damage had distorted the recovered bullets, making comparison with existing databases difficult. Rifling patterns were partially visible but insufficient for definitive matches. Detectives studied the preliminary reports with growing frustration. Physical evidence existed, but 1987 technology couldn't unlock its secrets. The killer had chosen his location well. The James River had served as his unwitting accomplice, washing away fingerprints, footprints, and microscopic clues that might have led directly to his door. Still, the evidence was preserved. Frozen samples waited in storage, holding their secrets for future technology to decode. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit arrived in Isle of Wight County carrying thick files and grim expertise. Special agents had been tracking a disturbing pattern of couples murders throughout the Tidewater region. The deaths of David and Robin fit the profile perfectly. Same victimology, an agent explained to local detectives during a late-night briefing. Young couples, isolated locations, proximity to water. The Colonial Parkway cases show identical characteristics. Since 1986, 4 couples had been murdered or had vanished along Virginia's Colonial Parkway. The scenic route connecting Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown had become a hunting ground for someone who understood how to exploit trust and vulnerability. The pattern was terrifyingly consistent. Couples parked in scenic, secluded areas, vehicles found abandoned, with no signs of struggle inside, bodies discovered near water when they were found at all. The killer approached victims with authority or deception, separating them from the safety of their cars before revealing his true intentions. Federal agents spread crime scene photographs across the conference table. Look at the positioning. Each attack occurred during late evening hours. Each location offered multiple escape routes. The killer knows this area intimately. Local detectives absorbed the implications with growing unease. They weren't hunting a random killer or crime of passion. They faced a predator who had studied their community, identified vulnerable locations, and planned his attacks with military precision. The media began connecting the dots independently. Newspaper headlines screamed about a Tidewater killer stalking young couples. Television reporters broadcast warnings about parking in isolated areas. Parents forbade teenage children from dating until the killer was captured. Fear transformed the region's social landscape overnight. Lovers' lanes that had existed for decades suddenly became ghost towns. Restaurants and movie theaters reported dramatic drops in young couples' patronage. High school parking lots emptied immediately after final bells rang. The killer's psychological profile emerged from FBI analysis. White male, aged 25 to 40, familiar with law enforcement techniques, possibly impersonating an officer to gain victims' compliance. He possessed detailed knowledge of the area's geography and tidal patterns, but profiles and patterns couldn't identify a name or face. The killer remained a shadow, striking without warning and vanishing without trace. Detectives spent October and November chasing leads that evaporated like morning mist. Every tip generated hope. Every dead end deepened frustration. The case consumed their days and haunted their nights. A jealous ex-boyfriend emerged as an early suspect. Robin's friends mentioned someone who'd been upset about her spending time with David. Polygraph examinations proved inconclusive. Alibis checked out under scrutiny. The lead dissolved. Truckers who frequented the area became persons of interest. Several drivers remembered passing through Isle of Wight County the night David and Robin disappeared. One recalled seeing a dark van near the refuge entrance, but couldn't provide license plate numbers or distinctive details. The most promising lead involved reports of someone impersonating a police officer. Multiple witnesses described encounters with a man claiming to be law enforcement, approaching couples in parked cars, and demanding identification. The description varied: tall, short, mustached, clean-shaven, but the pattern seemed significant. Investigators distributed composite sketches based on witness descriptions. Tips flooded in, each requiring careful follow-up. Dozens of men were questioned and cleared. The impersonator, if he existed, had vanished as completely as David and Robin. Forensic analysis of David's truck revealed minimal, useful evidence. Fingerprints belonged to family members and friends, with legitimate access. No forced entry was apparent. The killer had approached the truck without triggering defensive reactions, suggesting deception rather than overwhelming force. Ballistics experts examined the recovered bullets extensively. The .38 caliber weapon showed distinctive rifling patterns, but no matches appeared in state or federal databases. The killer's gun remained unregistered and untraceable. As winter approached, the investigation's momentum slowed. Active leads were exhausted. Fresh evidence stopped appearing. Detectives continued working the case, but community attention began shifting to other concerns. By Christmas 1987, the murders of David Lee Knobling and Robin Margaret Edwards had joined the growing list of unsolved Colonial Parkway killings. Files were maintained and occasionally reviewed, but no breakthrough seemed imminent. The families celebrated their first holiday without David and Robin, surrounded by empty chairs and overwhelming grief. They maintained faith that justice would eventually prevail, but that faith was tested with each passing day. By late 1988, the investigation had reached the bureaucratic equivalent of life support. Detectives continued reviewing files during quiet moments, but new cases demanded attention. Budget constraints limited overtime for cold case work. The evidence boxes were sealed and stored in the state police warehouse. The families of David and Robin met regularly with investigators, pleading for updates and renewed efforts. Each meeting ended with promises to continue working the case and heartbreaking acknowledgments that fresh leads had dried up. However, one decision made during this period would prove crucial decades later. As new DNA preservation protocols were implemented statewide, evidence from unsolved homicides was recatalogued and stored under strict temperature controls. The semen samples recovered from Robin's body were transferred to specialized freezer units designed for long-term preservation. Evidence technicians followed emerging guidelines for chain-of-custody documentation. Each sample received detailed labeling and tracking numbers. The decision wasn't made with future DNA analysis in mind. The technology didn't exist yet. Instead, it reflected standard procedure for preserving biological evidence in major crimes. The technicians were simply following protocol, unaware they were safeguarding the key to eventual justice. Community vigils continued for several months after the murders. Families and friends gathered monthly at the Ragged Island boat launch, placing flowers and sharing memories. Local churches held memorial services on significant anniversaries. Gradually, however, the vigils grew smaller. Families moved away or became absorbed in daily survival. Friends graduated, married, and started their own families. The acute pain of loss evolved into chronic grief that could be managed rather than cured. Isle of Wight County slowly returned to normal rhythms. Parents still watched their teenagers more carefully than before, but life resumed its forward momentum. New residents arrived who knew nothing about the murders. Time began its healing work, layer by layer. The case files gathered dust in storage, waiting for technology and determination to catch up with truth. Evidence preservation protocols had created a bridge to the future, though no one recognized it at the time. Somewhere, a killer continued living his life, confident that his secrets were safe beneath the waters of time. The 1990s and 2000s brought revolutionary advances in forensic science, but budget constraints and caseload pressures kept many cold cases sealed in storage. DNA analysis became routine for current investigations, while older cases waited for available resources and political will. Families of David and Robin maintained quiet memorial traditions. Annual remembrance gatherings continued, though attendance dwindled as years passed. Parents aged under the weight of unresolved grief, never abandoning hope, but learning to live with uncertainty. During this period, genealogical databases began transforming criminal investigations. Ancestry websites and family tree research created vast networks of genetic information. Law enforcement agencies slowly recognized the potential for connecting old evidence to new identification techniques. The science of DNA analysis advanced dramatically. What required large samples and clear preservation in 1987 could now be accomplished with microscopic fragments and heavily degraded material. Polymerase chain reaction technology allowed amplification of DNA from virtually invisible traces. Cold case units were established in major jurisdictions as public pressure grew for addressing unsolved crimes. Families of victims organized advocacy groups, demanding accountability and renewed investigation. Television programs, featuring cold case successes, generated political support for dedicated resources. However, the Colonial Parkway murders remained frustratingly elusive. Despite periodic reviews and FBI involvement, no significant breakthroughs emerged. The killer's identity remained as mysterious as it had been in 1987. Technology advanced, but someone still needed to apply it to specific evidence. Someone had to decide that David and Robin's case deserved renewed attention and resources. Someone had to believe that 30-year-old DNA samples might yield modern answers. The preserved evidence waited in frozen storage, holding its secrets like buried treasure. Genealogical databases grew larger each year, creating an ever-expanding web of potential connections. The stage was being set for a breakthrough that no one could predict or schedule. Time moved forward, carrying both hope and disappointment in equal measure. Science evolved, databases expanded, and techniques improved. The convergence of technology and determination would eventually unlock what the James River had tried to hide. In the mid-2010s, the Virginia State Police Cold Case Unit launched a systematic review of unsolved homicides from the 1980s and 1990s. Lieutenant Cole Tim Lyon, the unit's new supervisor, brought fresh perspective and unwavering determination to cases that had frustrated investigators for decades. Every family deserves answers, Leon told his team during their first briefing. Technology has given us tools our predecessors couldn't imagine. It's time to put them to work. The Colonial Parkway murders topped their priority list. 8 young people had been killed or had vanished between 1986 and 1989. The cases had attracted national attention but remained unsolved despite extensive investigation. Fresh eyes and modern techniques offered renewed hope. Evidence from David and Robin's case was retrieved from storage and catalogued for re-examination. The preservation protocols implemented in 1988 had maintained sample integrity better than anyone expected. Microscopic fragments that seemed useless in 1987 now appeared potentially valuable. Forensic analysts began the delicate process of extracting DNA from 30-year-old tissue samples. Advanced polymerase chain reaction techniques allowed amplification of genetic material from incredibly small fragments. What had been scientifically impossible in 1987 became routine procedure by 2015. The process required patience and precision. Multiple attempts were necessary to isolate usable genetic material. Contamination risks demanded sterile conditions and careful handling. Each step was documented to ensure legal admissibility. Media attention intensified as word spread about renewed investigation efforts. Documentary filmmakers and true crime podcasters began revisiting the Colonial Parkway cases. Public interest generated political support for expanded cold case resources. Families cautiously allowed themselves to hope again. Previous disappointments had taught them to manage expectations, but scientific advances offered genuine reasons for optimism. After decades of waiting, meaningful progress seemed possible. The digitization process revealed previously overlooked details in witness statements and crime scene reports. Computer analysis identified patterns that had been invisible to investigators using 1980s technology. Every old case file was being viewed through modern analytical lenses. Progress was slow but steady. The foundation was being laid for breakthroughs that would shock the community and provide answers that had seemed impossible for over a quarter century. The sterile environment of the Virginia Department of Forensic Science Laboratory hummed with quiet intensity. Under brilliant white lights, forensic analysts worked with fragments of evidence that had waited decades for this moment. The tissue samples from Robin Edwards's body had survived 30 years in frozen storage, their cellular structure preserved but degraded. The analysts used cutting-edge extraction techniques to isolate microscopic amounts of genetic material from what appeared to be empty slides. "We're working with the equivalent of genetic dust," an expert explained to visiting detectives, "but modern amplification methods can turn dust into evidence." The polymerase chain reaction process required multiple attempts. Initial extractions failed to yield sufficient DNA for analysis. Contamination threatened to destroy already minimal samples. Each attempt consumed precious material that could never be replaced. On the 4th try, success emerged from failure. A partial DNA profile materialized on computer screens, 13 genetic markers that could be compared against existing databases. The profile was incomplete, but potentially significant. The DNA was uploaded to the combined DNA index system, where automated searches compared the genetic markers against millions of stored profiles. Hours passed without matches. The killer's DNA wasn't in the criminal databases. A forensic analyst suggested an alternative approach, forensic genealogy. The partial profile could be uploaded to genealogical databases used by families researching their ancestry. If the killer had relatives who had submitted DNA for family tree research, connections might emerge. The process required careful legal consideration. Privacy concerns and warrant requirements had to be addressed before proceeding. Law enforcement agencies were still developing protocols for using civilian genealogical databases. After weeks of legal review, approval came to proceed with forensic genealogy analysis. The partial DNA profile was uploaded to a major genealogical database under a coded identifier. Automated comparison algorithms began searching for potential relatives. 3 weeks later, a notification appeared on computer screens. Multiple potential genetic connections had been identified, all pointing to families in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia. The breakthrough that would solve the case had just begun its slow reveal. January 15, 2024. Computer screens displayed a genealogical family tree that would change everything. The DNA profile from Robin Edwards' case had generated multiple matches within a single extended family residing in Hampton Roads, Virginia. The genealogical analysis pointed to a cluster of relatives sharing genetic markers with their unknown perpetrator. By tracing family connections and comparing DNA percentages, analysts narrowed their focus to a specific branch of the family tree. One name emerged as the most likely source of the DNA: Alan W. Wilmer, Sr. Born in 1945, Wilmer had operated a small fishing and marine service business in the Hampton Roads area. He had died in 2017, making arrest impossible, but not preventing identification. Lieutenant Cole Tim Lyon authorized immediate investigation into Wilmer's background and activities. During the 1980s, what detectives discovered shocked them. Wilmer had possessed detailed knowledge of the James River and Chesapeake Bay waterways, operated boats in the Ragged Island area, and had registered fishing licenses for locations near the crime scene. More disturbing, Wilmer had no criminal record. He had lived an apparently normal life, operated a legitimate business, and raised a family. Nothing in his background suggested the capacity for brutal murder. To confirm the genetic identification, investigators requested DNA samples from Wilmer's immediate family members. His widow and adult children cooperated fully, understanding the importance of providing closure to other families. Comparative analysis confirmed the match with overwhelming certainty. The DNA recovered from Robin Edwards' body in 1987 belonged to Alan W. Wilmer Sr. The probability of error was less than 1 in a quadrillion. But the investigation revealed an even more shocking connection. The same DNA profile matched evidence from another unsolved homicide: the 1989 murder of Teresa Lynn Spa Howell, a young woman found dead in York County. Wilmer had killed at least 3 people. Lieutenant Cole Leon faced the challenge of announcing a breakthrough that could never result in prosecution. Wilmer's death had eliminated any possibility of arrest or trial. Justice would have to take a different form. The conference room at Virginia State Police headquarters buzzed with nervous energy as detectives prepared to contact the families of David Knobling and Robin Edwards. After 37 years of waiting, they finally had answers to share. Lieutenant Cole Lyon personally made the calls. "I have news about your case," he told each family. "Can we arrange to meet in person?" David's brother, now in his 50s, had never stopped hoping for closure. "Is this good news or bad news?" he asked. "It's news," Leon replied carefully. "We've identified the person responsible for your brother's death." The meetings took place in private offices, away from media attention and public scrutiny. Families who had endured decades of uncertainty finally learned the name of their loved one's killer: Alan W. Wilmer, Sr. The revelation brought complex emotions. Relief at finally having answers mixed with frustration that Wilmer had escaped earthly justice. Families struggled to process that the killer had lived a normal life while their children remained dead. Robin's mother, now elderly and frail, wept quietly as Lieutenant Cole Lyon explained the DNA evidence. "I always knew someone would solve this case," she whispered. "I just hoped I'd live to see it." Detectives provided detailed explanations of the forensic genealogy process and the scientific certainty of their identification. Families asked technical questions about DNA analysis and legal questions about posthumous prosecution. The answers were satisfying, yet incomplete. Science had provided identification with unprecedented accuracy, but death had robbed justice of its traditional resolution. There would be no arrest, no trial, no sentencing, only truth, delivered 37 years after the crimes. Media inquiries intensified as word of the breakthrough spread through law enforcement circles. Lieutenant Cole Lyon prepared for public announcement, knowing the revelation would generate national attention and renewed interest in other Colonial Parkway cases. Local television stations began preparing special reports. Documentary producers contacted the families about potential interviews. The quiet grief that had surrounded the case for decades was about to become very public again. The announcement came on February 2nd, 2024, during a packed press conference at Virginia State Police Headquarters. Lieutenant Cole Tim Lyon stood before microphones and cameras, flanked by forensic experts and case investigators. Today, we announce the resolution of a case that has haunted our community for 37 years, Lyon began. Through advanced DNA analysis and forensic genealogy, we have identified the person responsible for the murders of David Lee Knobling and Robin Margaret Edwards. The revelation of Alan W. Wilmer Sr.'s identity sent shockwaves through Hampton Roads. Neighbors who had known him described a quiet man who operated a marine service business and kept to himself. Nothing in his public persona suggested criminal behavior. Local media outlets scrambled to piece together Wilmer's biography. He had been born in Portsmouth, served briefly in the military, and operated various small businesses throughout the 1980s and 1990s. His familiarity with area waterways had helped him evade detection for decades. Online forums erupted with discussion and speculation. True crime enthusiasts dissected every available detail about Wilmer's life and activities. Social media platforms buzzed with theories about potential additional victims. The families of David and Robin participated in follow-up interviews, sharing their relief at finally knowing their killer's identity. Their dignity and grace in the face of decades-long tragedy touched viewers throughout the region. However, questions remained unanswered. How many other victims might Wilmer have claimed? Had he been responsible for additional Colonial Parkway murders? His death had closed the door on interrogation and confession. Investigators announced plans to review other unsolved cases for potential connections to Wilmer. His DNA profile would be compared against evidence from dozens of cold cases. The identification of one killer might unlock multiple mysteries. Community reaction was mixed. Relief at solving a notorious case competed with frustration that traditional justice was impossible. Wilmer had escaped prosecution by dying peacefully, never facing consequences for his crimes. The announcement marked a beginning rather than an ending. Truth had emerged, but its implications would reverberate through the community for months to come. Community reactions to Wilmer's identification reflected the complex emotions surrounding posthumous justice. Online forums, local newspaper comment sections, and social media platforms became outlets for decades of suppressed fear and frustration. "He was living among us all this time," posted one longtime Isle of Wight County resident. "How many times did I see him at the marina or the grocery store, never knowing what he'd done?" Neighbors who had known Wilmer personally struggled to reconcile their memories with his revealed identity. He had attended community events, operated his business professionally, and maintained seemingly normal relationships. The banality of evil proved more disturbing than dramatic criminality. Some residents recalled details that suddenly seemed significant. A former marina employee remembered Wilmer being particularly knowledgeable about tide schedules and river currents. A neighbor recalled seeing him cleaning his boat unusually thoroughly after fishing trips. The revelation sparked renewed interest in other unsolved Colonial Parkway cases. Families of additional victims contacted investigators, hoping Wilmer might be connected to their loved ones' deaths. Each inquiry required careful analysis and comparison. Religious leaders in the community struggled to address questions about justice, forgiveness, and divine judgment. How should people of faith respond when earthly justice proves impossible? Their sermons explored themes of ultimate accountability and eternal consequences. Local high schools organized assemblies addressing safety, awareness, and personal security. Teachers used the case resolution to discuss trusting instincts and avoiding dangerous situations. The tragedy became a teaching tool for a new generation. Documentarians and true crime podcasters descended on the area, seeking interviews and gathering material for upcoming productions. The quiet community that had endured decades of uncertainty suddenly found itself at the center of national media attention. Lieutenant Cole Lyon received hundreds of emails and letters praising the investigation team's persistence. Many included suggestions for reviewing other cold cases using similar techniques. The success story inspired hope for families nationwide. Lieutenant Cole Tim Lyon faced an unusual challenge: how to provide closure for a case that could never reach traditional resolution. Without the possibility of arrest or trial, he needed to create an alternative form of accountability and community healing. The solution emerged from discussions with victim advocacy groups and legal experts: a public courtroom of evidence presentation. The session would provide formal documentation of investigative findings, allowing families and community members to witness the evidence that identified Wilmer as the killer. Plans for the presentation required careful coordination. The courthouse auditorium was reserved for a special evening session. Evidence exhibits were prepared, including DNA analysis charts, crime scene photographs, and timeline reconstructions. Expert witnesses agreed to explain their findings to the public. Local media was invited to broadcast the proceedings live. Streaming technology would allow nationwide viewing for those interested in the case's resolution. Transparency would replace the secrecy that had surrounded the investigation for decades. Families of David and Robin were consulted throughout the planning process. Their input shaped the presentation's tone and content. They wanted dignity and respect for their loved ones, not sensationalism or exploitation. Security measures were implemented to manage public interest and maintain order. The proceedings would follow legal protocols, even though no actual trial was occurring. The goal was community education and emotional closure. Legal experts reviewed the presentation format to ensure constitutional compliance. While unprecedented, the courtroom of evidence concept didn't violate any legal principles. Public access to government information supported transparency. 2 weeks after the announcement, promotional materials appeared throughout Hampton Roads. Truth revealed: the Knobling Edwards murder case would be presented on February 20, 2024. Public seating would be available on a first-come basis. Hundreds of community members planned to attend. National media requested press credentials. The unprecedented presentation would attempt to provide justice through truth rather than prosecution. February 20th, 2024. The courthouse auditorium in Isle of Wight County filled beyond capacity as community members, journalists, and family members gathered for an unprecedented presentation. Lieutenant Cole Tim Lyon approached the podium with the solemnity of someone delivering a verdict that had been 37 years in the making. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lyon began, his voice carrying across the silent chamber, "we gather tonight not for a traditional trial, but for something equally important: the presentation of truth. This is a courtroom where evidence speaks, where science delivers justice, and where closure becomes possible." Large screens displayed the first exhibit, a photograph of David's Ford Ranger, as it had been found in September 1987. The image transported viewers back to that morning when everything changed: doors open, wipers running, radio playing, life interrupted. Lyon continued his methodical presentation. "From archived crime scene photographs, we now know that tire tracks found near the vehicle matched the tread pattern of a truck registered to Alan W. Wilmer Sr. This evidence went unrecognized for decades until digital enhancement revealed the connection. The audience absorbed each detail with intense focus. Parents who had lost sleep for decades finally understood how their partifully community's innocence had been shattered. Young people learned about evil that had walked among them unrecognized. Exhibit A demonstrates the calculated nature of this crime, Lyon explained, using a laser pointer to highlight specific details. The killer approached with authority, or deception, sufficient to convince David and Robin to leave their vehicle voluntarily. No signs of forced entry exist. Trust was weaponized. The first chapter of truth had begun to unfold. In this courtroom, without defendant or defense attorney, evidence would serve as both prosecutor and judge. The medical examiner took the podium as projected autopsy images filled the screens. The audience fell silent, understanding they were witnessing the clinical documentation of 2 young lives, stolen without mercy. David Knobling suffered 2 gunshot wounds, the examiner explained with professional detachment that couldn't mask the tragedy. The first bullet entered behind his right ear, consistent with execution-style positioning. The second wound to his shoulder suggests he attempted to flee or protect Robin Edwards. The clinical language made the horror more bearable, yet no less devastating. Trajectory analysis confirmed David had been standing when shot, then fell before receiving the second wound. He had tried to escape, tried to save Robin, tried to live. Robin Edwards's injuries tell an even more disturbing story, the examiner continued. Evidence indicates she was subjected to violent assault before being killed. The execution-style gunshot wound to the back of her head shows she was forced to kneel before death. Mothers in the audience wept silently. Fathers clenched their fists. The sterile language of forensic pathology couldn't diminish what everyone understood. Two young people had suffered terribly in their final moments. The ballistic evidence points to a .38 caliber revolver using hollow point ammunition, the examiner concluded. This weapon choice indicates premeditation. The killer came prepared to ensure maximum damage and victim incapacitation. The autopsy presentation ended with a moment of silence. Even in a courtroom of evidence, human dignity demanded acknowledgement of the lives lost. David and Robin deserved more than clinical analysis. They deserved remembrance as the vibrant young people they had been. A forensic biologist approached the podium as DNA analysis charts appeared on the screens. The complex diagrams looked like hieroglyphics to most viewers, but they contained the scientific key that had unlocked 37 years of silence. In 1987, we recovered biological evidence from Robin Edwards's body using the limited preservation techniques available at that time, the scientist explained. The samples were frozen and stored according to emerging protocols. Though DNA analysis was primitive by today's standards, the audience learned how microscopic fragments had survived decades in storage. Tissue. Samples smaller than dust motes had preserved genetic material through careful temperature control and documentation. The foresight of evidence technicians in 1988 had made eventual justice possible. Modern DNA amplification techniques allowed us to extract a partial genetic profile from these preserved samples, the biologist continued. 13 genetic markers were identified and compared against existing criminal databases. The CODIS search had yielded no matches. The killer's DNA wasn't in any law enforcement database, confirming he had no prior criminal record. This revelation explained why traditional investigative methods had failed for decades. We then utilized forensic genealogy, uploading the DNA profile to civilian genealogical databases, the scientist explained. Family tree analysis pointed us to a specific lineage in Hampton Roads, Virginia. The genealogical process was complex but definitive. By tracing shared genetic markers through multiple family branches, analysts had narrowed their search to a single individual, Alan W. Wilmer Sr. Comparative analysis using family members' DNA confirmed our identification with overwhelming certainty, the biologist concluded. The probability of error is less than 1 in a quadrillion. Science has provided absolute identification of Robin Edwards's killer. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Mathematics and molecular biology had succeeded where traditional detective work had failed. Truth had emerged from dust. Lieutenant Cole Lyon returned to the podium for the presentation's most personal segment. Family members of David and Robin had requested the opportunity to address the community that had supported them through decades of uncertainty. David's brother, now graying and weathered by years of grief, spoke first. 37 years ago, my little brother left home for what should have been an ordinary Friday night. He never came back. For decades, we wondered who had taken him from us. And why? His voice cracked with emotion, but he continued. Today, we finally know. Alan Wilmer, Sr., stole David's future, stole Robin's childhood, stole our family's peace. We can't bring them back, but we can finally put names to our loss. Robin's mother, now elderly and supported by family members, spoke next. Robin was 14 years old. She loved music, loved laughing with friends, loved life itself. She trusted people because she'd never met evil before. Her trust was used against her. The mother's words carried the weight of decades spent wondering, hoping, and slowly accepting that answers might never come. I always believed someone would solve this case. I prayed I'd live to see justice. Today, science has given us truth. Other family members shared memories of David and Robin as vibrant young people, rather than crime statistics. They spoke of David's generosity, his protective nature, his dreams of building a life in Isle of Wight County. They remembered Robin's spirit, her laughter, her potential cut tragically short. We want people to remember them as they lived, not just how they died, David's sister concluded. They were more than victims. They were beloved children, siblings, friends. Their deaths diminished all of us. The family testimonies transformed the clinical evidence presentation into something profoundly human. Behind every DNA marker and ballistic fragment lay real people whose absence had echoed through decades. A detective from the original investigation team took the podium to address lingering questions about the case. Now retired, he had carried the weight of unsolved murders for decades, wondering if justice would ever prevail. We investigated every lead, interviewed hundreds of people, followed every possible connection, he explained. The case consumed us. We knew someone was responsible, but 1987 technology couldn't identify who. The detective described the frustration of having evidence, but lacking the tools to decode it. Physical clues existed, DNA samples, ballistic fragments, crime scene details, but science hadn't advanced enough to provide answers. Alan Wilmer Sr. had no criminal record, the detective continued. His name never appeared in our investigation. He lived a normal life while we searched for a monster. The banality of evil made him invisible. Audience members asked pointed questions about the investigation's scope and methodology. Had other suspects been cleared too quickly? Could more have been done with available technology? The detective answered honestly, acknowledging both the thoroughness of their work and its limitations. We preserved every piece of evidence according to emerging protocols, he emphasized. That preservation ultimately solved the case. Science caught up with truth. The detective revealed additional details about Wilmer's activities during the 1980s. Fishing licenses placed him near the crime scene regularly. His boat registrations showed familiarity with James River currents. His marine business provided cover for nighttime activities. He knew the area intimately, the detective explained. He understood tidal patterns, escape routes, and how to use the river to hide evidence. His local knowledge made him nearly unstoppable. The presentation concluded with confirmation that Wilmer's DNA had also been linked to the 1989 murder of Teresa Lynn Spa Howell. The killer had claimed at least 3 victims before disappearing into apparent normalcy. Lieutenant Cole Lyon approached the podium for the session's final segment. The evidence had been presented, families had spoken, and questions had been answered. Now came the moment of formal conclusion, a verdict delivered not by jury, but by scientific certainty. Based on DNA evidence, ballistic analysis, and investigative findings, we formally identify Alan W. Wilmer Sr. as the person responsible for the murders of David Lee Knobling and Robin Margaret Edwards, Lyon announced with quiet authority. The declaration carried the weight of legal pronouncement, even without traditional courtroom proceedings. Science had provided proof beyond reasonable doubt. Mathematics had delivered justice that human testimony alone could never achieve. While Mr. Wilmer's death in 2017 prevents prosecution, truth has finally emerged, Lyon continued. The families of David and Robin now know who stole their loved ones. The community understands who shattered their sense of security. Lyon explained that Wilmer's DNA profile would be compared against evidence from other unsolved cases throughout Virginia. His identification might unlock additional mysteries, providing closure for families who had waited decades for answers. This case demonstrates the importance of evidence preservation and the power of advancing science, Lyon emphasized. Technology that didn't exist in 1987 has provided definitive answers in WSIDE, end quote. 2024. Other cold cases may yield similar breakthroughs. The lieutenant colonel concluded with words that resonated beyond the auditorium walls. Time may dull memory, but it never erases evidence. Science refuses to let silence win. Truth finds a way. The audience rose in spontaneous applause, not celebration of death or vengeance, but acknowledgement of persistence, finally rewarded. 37 years of questions had been answered through determination and advancing technology. As people filed out of the courthouse, many carried a sense of closure they hadn't expected to experience. Justice had taken an unconventional form, but it had arrived nonetheless. In the weeks following the courtroom of evidence presentation, the community began processing the complex emotions surrounding posthumous justice. Alan W. Wilmer Sr. had escaped earthly consequences for his crimes, but his identification had provided something equally valuable: truth. The families of David and Robin found unexpected peace in finally knowing their killer's identity. Uncertainty had been replaced with facts, speculation with scientific certainty. They could begin the process of true healing, armed with complete knowledge of what had happened to their loved ones. David's brother established a memorial scholarship at the local high school, honoring his brother's memory while helping other young people pursue their dreams. Robin's family created a safety awareness program, teaching teenagers about trusting their instincts and avoiding dangerous situations. The case resolution sparked renewed interest in other Colonial Parkway murders. Virginia State Police announced plans to re-examine evidence from similar cases using advanced DNA techniques and forensic genealogy. Hope flickered for families who had waited even longer for answers. Local high schools incorporated the case into their safety curriculum, discussing how evil could hide behind ordinary appearances. Students learned about the importance of trusting instincts, staying in groups, and maintaining communication with family members. The marina, where Wilmer had operated his business, displayed a memorial plaque honoring victims of unsolved crimes. The gesture acknowledged that healing required remembering those who had been lost while working toward preventing future tragedies. Documentarians began producing long-form investigations into the case, exploring how forensic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigations. The story became a model for other jurisdictions struggling with decades-old, unsolved murders. Religious leaders throughout the region addressed questions about divine justice and human accountability. Their sermons explored themes of ultimate consequence and eternal judgment, providing spiritual framework for those struggling with incomplete earthly justice. The tide that had once hidden evidence now seemed symbolic of truth's eventual emergence. What the James River had tried to conceal, science had finally revealed. 1 year later, the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge hosted a memorial service for David and Robin. Families, friends, investigators, and community members gathered at the boat launch, where David's truck had been discovered 38 years earlier. The location that had once symbolized terror and uncertainty now represented persistence and eventual truth. Time had transformed the meaning of this place, from crime scene to memorial ground, where healing could finally begin. Lieutenant Cole Lyon delivered remarks acknowledging the long journey from discovery to resolution. "This refuge has witnessed both tragedy and triumph," he said. "Evil struck here, but truth ultimately prevailed. Science refused to let silence win." Robin's surviving family members placed flowers in the water, watching the current carry their offerings downstream toward the Chesapeake Bay. The same river that had concealed evidence now served as a pathway for remembrance and healing. David's nephew, now approaching the age his uncle had been when murdered, spoke about legacy and justice. Uncle David would be proud to know that his case helped develop techniques that could solve other families' mysteries. His death wasn't meaningless if it helps bring others home. The gathering concluded with a moment of silence, followed by the reading of names from other unsolved cases throughout Virginia. Each name represented a family still waiting, still hoping, still believing that science might eventually provide answers. As the memorial service ended, participants understood that justice had taken an unconventional form. Traditional prosecution had proven impossible, but truth had emerged nonetheless. The silence that had protected a killer for decades had finally been broken. The James River continued its ancient flow toward the bay, carrying with it the echoes of voices that had demanded answers. Time had tested everyone's faith, but persistence had ultimately been rewarded. In the end, the water, that had hidden secrets for 37 years, had surrendered them to science, determination, and the unwavering belief that every life deserves justice, even when that justice arrives long after hope seems lost.